I watched through my kitchen window as the HOA president's Mercedes SUV plowed straight into my property marker for the third time this winter. And I smiled while sipping my coffee, because this time I had video evidence and a lawyer on speed dial. My name is Patrick Lawson, and I have lived in the Pinewood Estates subdivision in Eden Prairie, Minnesota, for 8 years. The neighborhood was gorgeous, with mature oak trees lining the streets and well-maintained homes that looked like something out of a home improvement magazine. For the first 6 years, everything was peaceful. I mowed my lawn, paid my dues, and went about my business without any drama. Then Patricia Morrison became the HOA president, and my life became a living nightmare. Patricia was exactly what you would picture when someone says the word Karen. She was 52 years old with that specific haircut that screams, "I want to speak to your manager," and an attitude that could curdle milk. She drove a white Mercedes GLE and wore expensive athleisure, where even though I had never seen her set foot in a gym. Her favorite hobby seemed to be finding violations in the neighborhood and sending out nasty letters on official HOA letterhead. The snow stake incident started in late October 2025. I had just installed orange reflective stakes along the edge of my driveway and lawn, marking the boundaries of my property. This was a common practice in Minnesota, where snowplows and snow removal services needed clear markers to avoid damaging lawns, mailboxes, and underground utilities. Every winter, people put these stakes out, and every spring they took them down. It was practical, necessary, and had never been an issue before Patricia took over. I was in my garage organizing some tools when I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. Patricia's Mercedes pulled into my driveway, and she stepped out wearing white jeans and a puffy vest, sunglasses perched on her head despite the overcast sky. "Patrick, we need to talk about those stakes," she said, gesturing toward my lawn without any greeting or pleasantries. "What about them?" I asked, setting down the wrench I was holding. "They're not aesthetically pleasing. The HOA guidelines clearly state that all lawn ornaments must be approved by the Architectural Review Committee." I stared at her for a moment, waiting for the punchline. "Patricia, these aren't lawn ornaments. They're snow markers. They're functional. I don't care what you call them. They're orange and tacky, and they need to come down." She crossed her arms over her chest, and I could see she was serious. "Everyone in Minnesota uses these. They keep snow removal services from damaging property. Have you seen the Johnsons' mailbox? The plow took it out last winter because they didn't have markers. The Johnsons don't live in the historic section of Pinewood Estates. Your property fronts the main boulevard, and these stakes are visible from the street. They lower property values." I felt my jaw tighten. "Patricia, I'm not taking them down. They serve a purpose, and I'm not violating any reasonable HOA rule." Her eyes narrowed behind her designer sunglasses. "You have 48 hours to remove them, or you'll be fined $200 per day until they're gone. I'm sending you an official violation notice today." She turned on her heel and walked back to her Mercedes, leaving me standing in my garage wondering if she had lost her mind. I went inside and called my neighbor, Marcus Chen, who had served on the HOA board before Patricia's hostile takeover. "She can't do that, can she?" I asked him. Marcus sighed heavily on the other end of the line. "Technically, the HOA covenants give the Architectural Review Committee authority over external modifications and decorations, but snow stakes have always been considered temporary and functional. Nobody has ever challenged them before. So what do I do? You can appeal to the board, but Patricia stacked it with her friends after the last election. Janet Reynolds and Kimberly Foster do whatever she says. Your best bet might be to document everything and consult with a lawyer if she actually tries to fine you." I thanked Marcus and hung up, feeling a knot forming in my stomach. I had worked hard to afford this house. I was a civil engineer for a construction firm in Minneapolis, and I had saved for years to buy in a good neighborhood. The last thing I wanted was a legal battle with my HOA, but I also wasn't about to be bullied into making my property vulnerable to damage. True to her word, Patricia sent the violation notice. It arrived by certified mail 2 days later, printed on official letterhead with the Pinewood Estates logo. The letter stated that my snow stakes violated Section 7.3 of the HOA covenants regarding unapproved external decorations and structures, and that I had 10 days to remove them or face daily fines starting at $200 per day. I read the covenant document that night, all 47 pages of it. Section 7.3 was vague and broadly written, giving the Architectural Review Committee discretion over anything that materially altered the external appearance of properties visible from public streets or common areas. There was no specific exemption for functional items like snow stakes, but there was also no explicit prohibition. I decided to attend the next HOA board meeting, which was scheduled for the first Tuesday in November. The meetings were held in the community clubhouse, a nice facility with a fireplace and meeting rooms that the neighborhood shared for events. When I arrived at 7 in the evening, about 15 other homeowners were already there, most of them looking as frustrated as I felt. Patricia sat at the head of the table with Janet Reynolds and Kimberly Foster flanking her sides. Janet was in her late 40s with short blonde hair, and Kimberly was younger, maybe 35, with dark hair pulled back in a severe bun. They both had the same pursed lip expression that Patricia wore. "We'll now hear from homeowners," Patricia announced, barely looking up from her papers. "Please keep comments brief." I raised my hand, and she acknowledged me with a curt nod. "I received a violation notice about snow stakes on my property," I said, standing up. "These are functional safety markers, not decorations. I'm formally appealing this violation." "Noted," Patricia said. "Your appeal is denied." The Architectural Review Committee met yesterday and unanimously agreed that the stakes are unsightly and must be removed. "But you didn't even hear my reasoning," I protested. "We don't need to. The covenants are clear, and the committee has discretion." Next, I felt heat rising in my face. "This is ridiculous. These stakes protect my property from snow removal damage. Every other neighborhood in Minnesota allows them." "We're not every other neighborhood," Patricia snapped. "We have standards in Pinewood Estates. If you wanted to live somewhere with orange stakes cluttering every yard, you should have bought in a different subdivision. Your 10 days start from the date on the notice. Next homeowner, please." I sat down, my hands shaking with anger. Several other homeowners spoke up about various issues, from parking complaints to questions about the landscaping budget, but Patricia dismissed most of them with the same cold efficiency. The meeting ended after 45 minutes, and I left feeling more frustrated than ever. Over the next week, I consulted with a lawyer named David Greenberg who specialized in HOA disputes. He listened to my story and reviewed the covenant documents. "You have a case," he said, leaning back in his office chair. "The problem is that fighting this could cost you thousands in legal fees, and there's no guarantee you'll win. Judges often defer to HOA discretion unless there's clear evidence of discrimination or abuse of power. So, what do you recommend?" "Document everything. Take photos, save every email and letter, and keep records of any damage that occurs because you can't use the markers. If she fines you, don't pay immediately. We can challenge the fines as unreasonable, but we need to build a case first." I left his office feeling only slightly better. The 10-day deadline came and went, and I didn't remove the stakes. Another certified letter arrived a week later, informing me that I was being fined $200 per day, starting immediately, until the violation was corrected. The letter also stated that if the fines went unpaid for more than 90 days, the HOA could place a lien on my property. I called David Greenberg again, and he sent a response letter on my behalf, arguing that the fines were excessive and unreasonable for a functional safety device. Patricia responded through the HOA's attorney, stating that the fines would continue, and that I had 30 days to either comply or face further legal action. November turned into December, and the first major snowfall hit Eden Prairie. I kept my snow stakes in place, and I hired a private snow removal service run by a guy named Tom Sullivan. Tom was in his 50s, with a weathered face and a no-nonsense attitude. He had been plowing driveways in the area for 20 years. "Those stakes are smart," he said when he arrived for the first clearing. "I wish everyone used them. Makes my job a lot easier and keeps me from accidentally tearing up lawns." "The HOA president wants me to take them down," I told him. He shook his head. "That's stupid. Who cares what color they are if they work?" Tom did a great job clearing my driveway and the apron where it met the street. He carefully followed the markers and didn't touch my lawn. Everything went smoothly until the next morning when I woke up to angry pounding on my front door. I opened it to find Patricia standing on my porch, her face red with fury. "Your snow stakes damaged my car. What are you talking about? I was driving past your house last night after the storm, and I swerved to avoid a deer. My car hit one of those ridiculous stakes and it scratched my paint and dented my bumper." I almost laughed. "Patricia, if you hit my marker, that means you drove onto my property. The stakes are at least 3 feet from the street. I don't care. Those stakes are a hazard and you're going to pay for my repairs." "No, I'm not. You damaged your car by driving on my lawn. That's not my problem." She jabbed a finger at my chest. "You're going to regret this, Patrick. I'm doubling your fines, and I'm calling the city to report those stakes as a traffic hazard." She stormed off, and I closed the door, taking a deep breath. I immediately went outside to examine the area. Sure enough, there were tire tracks in the snow on my lawn about 4 feet from the street. One of my stakes was bent, and there was white paint transferred onto the orange reflective surface. I took photographs from every angle, including shots that clearly showed the tire tracks leading from the street onto my property. The next week, I received another letter from the HOA. The daily fines had indeed been increased to $400 per day, retroactive to the start of the violation period. I now supposedly owed over $8,000. The letter also stated that the HOA was pursuing legal action to force compliance and collect the fines. I forwarded everything to David Greenberg, and we scheduled a meeting. "This is getting out of hand," he said, reviewing the documents. "But the good news is that Patricia is overstepping. Retroactively increasing fines without notice is questionable, and her personal vendetta is becoming obvious. The fact that she damaged your property and is now retaliating makes this even clearer. What's my next move?" "We file a formal complaint with the board, requesting that Patricia recuse herself from all matters involving your property due to conflict of interest. We also send a demand letter requiring the HOA to cover the damage to your snow stake, and we start preparing for the possibility of litigation." David drafted the letters, and they were sent out before Christmas. I didn't hear back from the HOA until early January, when I received a terse response stating that my complaint was denied, and that Patricia had every right to continue her duties as HOA president. The letter made no mention of the damaged stake or her car accident. The fines kept accumulating on paper, but I refused to pay them. The Minnesota winter was brutal that year, with multiple snowstorms rolling through every week. Tom Sullivan continued to plow my driveway, and the snow stakes did their job perfectly. Meanwhile, I noticed that Patricia was driving more carefully past my house, taking the long way around the neighborhood to avoid my street whenever possible. Then I had an idea. It was early February, and I was reviewing my property survey documents for an unrelated reason when I noticed something interesting. My property had 6 iron survey markers buried at the corners and midpoints of my lot boundaries. These markers were placed by licensed surveyors and were legally protected. Removing or damaging them was actually a misdemeanor in Minnesota. The markers along my front property line were buried about 4 inches below ground level, right at the edge where my lawn met the street. During winter, they were completely hidden under snow and ice. I had always known they were there, but I had never thought much about them. The snow stakes I had installed were positioned about a foot inside my property line, leaving a small buffer zone. I realized that if Patricia or anyone else tried to cut the corner while driving past my house, especially during snowy conditions when the property boundaries weren't visible, they would likely drive right over these buried markers. The markers were solid iron and anchored deep in the ground. A car driving over them would definitely suffer damage, especially if the driver was going at any speed. I checked Minnesota law to confirm what I remembered from my engineering training. State statutes clearly stated that property monuments and survey markers were protected, and property owners had no obligation to mark or protect them beyond their initial placement by licensed surveyors. In fact, the law placed the burden on others not to damage them. An idea formed in my mind. I decided to remove my snow stakes. On a cold Saturday morning in mid-February, I went out and pulled up every single orange stake from my lawn. I loaded them into my garage and left my property boundaries completely unmarked. Then I called Tom Sullivan and told him I was switching to a different snow removal service. "Nothing personal, Tom. I just need to make a change." "No problem, Patrick. Good luck with everything." I hired a new service, one that was known for being cheaper but less careful. The guy's name was Randy Peterson, and he drove a beat-up truck with a worn plow blade. I specifically instructed him to only clear my driveway and to avoid the areas near the property line. "Just do the driveway itself," I told him. "Don't worry about the apron or the edges." "You got it," Randy said, clearly happy to have less work. I also set up 3 outdoor security cameras with night vision, positioned to cover my entire front yard and the street in front of my house. I made sure the footage was backed up to cloud storage automatically. Then I waited. Patricia noticed the missing stakes within 2 days. She actually knocked on my door, which surprised me. "I see you finally came to your senses," she said, her tone smug. "I'm glad you removed those hideous stakes." "I decided they weren't worth the hassle," I replied neutrally. "Good. Now about those fines. You still owe the HOA over $12,000. We're willing to reduce that to $8,000 if you pay within 30 days. I'll have my lawyer contact you." Her smile faded. "Don't be stupid, Patrick. Just pay the fines and move on. We'll see." She left, and I watched from my window as she walked back to her Mercedes. Over the next few weeks, I noticed her driving pattern changed. Without the orange stakes marking where my property ended, she started cutting the corner slightly when turning onto my street. It was subtle at first, just her right tires drifting a foot or so onto my lawn near the street edge. But as the winter continued and more snow piled up, obscuring the boundaries between the street and my property, she got more careless. I watched it happen on my security camera footage. Every few days, Patricia's white Mercedes would come around the corner, and her passenger side tires would roll right over the area where my buried property markers were located. She was probably driving over them regularly without knowing it, but the snow and ice cushioned the impact enough that she didn't cause or notice any damage. Then, in early March, we had a warm spell. The temperatures climbed into the 40s, and a lot of the snow melted. The street and lawns were still messy with slush and ice patches, but the thick snow cover was gone. The buried survey markers were now only protected by a couple inches of hard-packed ice and frozen ground. I was working from home that day, sitting at my kitchen table with my laptop, when I heard it. A loud metallic crunch, followed by the sound of grinding and scraping. I looked out the window and saw Patricia's Mercedes stopped at an awkward angle, half on the street and half on my lawn, right where I knew the survey markers were buried. I grabbed my phone and walked outside. Patricia was already out of her car, staring at the front passenger side with her mouth open. The tire was completely shredded, the rim was bent, and there was visible damage to the wheel well and lower body panel. Fluid was dripping onto the ice. "What the hell did you put in your lawn?" She shouted when she saw me. "I didn't put anything in my lawn," I said calmly, pulling out my phone to take pictures. "But there are survey markers along my property line. They've been there since the subdivision was built in 1998. You buried something to damage my car. This is vandalism." "No, Patricia. Those are legally placed and protected property monuments. You damaged your car by driving on my property." Her face turned purple. "You took down your stakes on purpose. You set me up." "I removed the stakes because you fined me for having them." "You told me to take them down, remember? And you're on my property right now because you cut the corner. That's trespassing and negligence on your part." "You're insane. I'm calling the police." "Go ahead. I have security camera footage of you repeatedly driving on my property over the past several weeks." That stopped her cold. She stared at me, her eyes wide, and I could see the calculations running through her mind. She pulled out her phone and made a call, but I noticed she called a tow truck instead of the police. I went back inside and reviewed my security camera footage. It was perfect. Multiple clips showed Patricia's Mercedes cutting across my property line near the street, and the final video clearly showed her driving onto my lawn and hitting the buried survey marker. I backed up all the footage to 3 separate locations and sent copies to David Greenberg. The tow truck arrived about 40 minutes later and loaded up Patricia's damaged Mercedes. She kept glaring at my house the entire time, but she didn't come to my door again. I figured that would be the end of it, but I was wrong. 3 days later, I received a lawsuit notice. Patricia Morrison, individually, was suing me for $25,000 in damages, claiming that I had deliberately created a hazard on my property with the intent to damage her vehicle. The lawsuit alleged negligence, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and creating a nuisance. I called David Greenberg immediately, and we met at his office that afternoon. "She doesn't have a case," David said after reviewing the lawsuit. "Property owners are not required to mark or protect legally placed survey monuments. She was repeatedly trespassing on your property, and you have video evidence of it. This is actually good for us because now we can countersue for the property damage she caused and the harassment." "What about the HOA fines?" "Those are separate, but we can use this lawsuit as evidence of her personal vendetta against you. A judge is going to look at this pattern of behavior and see it for what it is: abuse of power and harassment." We spent the next hour planning our response and preparing a counterclaim. David would file an answer to Patricia's lawsuit, denying all allegations and asserting affirmative defenses, including her own negligence and trespassing. We would also file a counterclaim against Patricia individually for property damage, trespassing, and harassment, and a separate claim against the Pinewood Estates HOA for unreasonable fines and selective enforcement. The lawsuit discovery process took several weeks. David subpoenaed records from the HOA, including all violation notices issued in the past 3 years, minutes from board meetings, and financial records. What we found was damning. Patricia had issued over 200 violation notices since becoming president 18 months ago, compared to less than 30 per year under previous administrations. The fines collected had increased by more than 400%, but the money wasn't being used for neighborhood improvements. Instead, the HOA had paid over $60,000 to Patricia's husband's landscaping company for consulting services that were never clearly defined. David also deposed Janet Reynolds and Kimberly Foster, the other board members. Under oath, both women admitted that Patricia had pushed for my violation without any input from them, and that the Architectural Review Committee had never actually met to discuss my snow stakes. Patricia had simply declared the violation on her own authority and told them to back her up. The case was scheduled for mediation in late April, which was standard practice in Minnesota civil courts. The mediator was a retired judge named Harold Stevenson, and we met at the courthouse in downtown Minneapolis on a rainy Tuesday morning. Patricia showed up with her lawyer, a tired-looking man named Brian Foster, who I later learned was Kimberly's husband. The conflict of interest was astounding, but it also showed how incestuous and corrupt the HOA board had become. Judge Stevenson listened to both sides present their cases. David laid out the timeline of events, presented the security camera footage, showed the survey documents proving the legal placement of the property markers, and detailed the pattern of harassment and selective enforcement by Patricia. He also presented evidence of the financial improprieties involving Patricia's husband's company. Patricia's lawyer tried to argue that I had removed the snow stakes with the deliberate intent to cause her harm, but Judge Stevenson wasn't buying it. "Counselor, your client ordered Mr. Lawson to remove those stakes under threat of fines. He complied. He can't be blamed for her subsequent decision to drive on his property," the judge said. "But he knew the survey markers were there," Brian argued weakly. "Of course he did. They're on his property survey, which is public record. Every property in Minnesota has survey markers. Drivers are expected to stay on the street and off private property. This is basic traffic law." The mediation broke for lunch, and Judge Stevenson met with each party separately. When it was our turn, he was blunt. "You have a strong case, Mr. Lawson. Honestly, this looks like harassment and abuse of power. If this goes to trial, I think you'll win and you might even get attorney's fees, but litigation is expensive and time-consuming. If they offer a reasonable settlement, I'd consider it." When we reconvened, Patricia's lawyer made an offer. They would drop the lawsuit against me, reduce my HOA fines to zero, and pay $5,000 toward my attorney's fees. In exchange, I would agree not to pursue any further claims against Patricia or the HOA. David and I stepped out to discuss it. "It's not a bad offer," he said, "but you're in a position of strength here. We can push for more." "I want her off the HOA board," I said. "And I want a full audit of the HOA finances. If she's been stealing money through her husband's company, everyone in the neighborhood deserves to know." We went back in and presented our counteroffer. We would accept the settlement only if Patricia agreed to resign from the HOA board immediately. If the HOA agreed to a full independent audit of its finances for the past 2 years, and if Patricia personally paid $10,000 for my attorney's fees and the damage to my property marker. Patricia exploded. "This is extortion. I'm not resigning." Judge Stevenson held up his hand. "Mrs. Morrison, I strongly suggest you consider this offer. The alternative is going to trial where all of this evidence becomes public record. The financial irregularities involving your husband's company alone could trigger criminal investigations. Mr. Lawson is being generous." She glared at me with pure hatred, but her lawyer whispered urgently in her ear. After 10 minutes of heated discussion, they accepted the terms. The settlement was drafted and signed that afternoon. Patricia resigned from the HOA board effective immediately, and the neighborhood would hold a special election for a new president within 60 days. The HOA agreed to hire an independent auditor to review the past 2 years of financial records, and Patricia wrote a personal check for $10,000 to cover my costs. As we left the courthouse, Patricia tried one last parting shot. "You think you've won, but everyone in the neighborhood is going to know what you did. You'll never be welcome in Pinewood Estates again." I turned to face her. "Patricia, everyone already knows what you did. They've been waiting for someone to stand up to you. Check the neighborhood Facebook group when you get home." Her face went pale, and I walked away, feeling lighter than I had in months. It turned out that Marcus Chen had been documenting Patricia's abuses for over a year, collecting complaints from other homeowners who had been harassed, fined, and bullied. When word spread about the lawsuit and settlement, he posted a detailed summary on the neighborhood social media page, and it exploded. Over 60 homeowners came forward with their own stories of unreasonable fines, selective enforcement, and intimidation. The independent audit was completed in June, and the results were even worse than we suspected. Patricia's husband's landscaping company had been paid over $90,000 over 18 months for services that were either never performed or vastly overcharged. The auditor found evidence of kickbacks, falsified invoices, and misappropriation of HOA funds. The report was forwarded to the Eden Prairie Police Department and the Hennepin County Attorney's Office. In July, Patricia Morrison and her husband were charged with theft by swindle and fraud. The criminal case moved slowly through the court system, but by October, both had pleaded guilty to reduced charges. Patricia was sentenced to 2 years of probation, 200 hours of community service, and was ordered to pay full restitution to the HOA. Her husband received a similar sentence plus a 30-day jail sentence served on weekends. The Morrisons put their house in Pinewood Estates up for sale in November and moved out before Christmas. I heard they relocated to some suburb on the other side of the Twin Cities, but I never bothered to confirm it. Meanwhile, the neighborhood held elections for a new HOA board. Marcus Chen was elected president, and 2 other longtime residents who had been vocal critics of Patricia's administration joined as board members. One of their first acts was to revise the covenant enforcement policies, adding clear definitions of what constituted legitimate violations, establishing an appeals process with neutral third parties, and limiting the board's discretion to impose fines. They also formally recognized that functional items like snow stakes, solar panels, and accessibility modifications were exempt from architectural review as long as they met basic safety and aesthetic standards. My orange snow stakes were officially deemed acceptable, though by that point I had replaced them with more subtle brown and white markers that blended better with the landscape. As for my property, I had the survey markers properly maintained and even added small warning signs near the street that read, "Property line survey monuments present." It was probably unnecessary, but after everything that happened, I wanted to be absolutely clear where my property ended and public space began. Life in Pinewood Estates gradually returned to normal. The neighborhood started feeling like a community again, instead of a police state. People actually talked to each other without fear of being reported for some imaginary violation. Block parties returned, and the HOA dues were used for actual improvements like fixing the playground equipment and repairing the walking paths instead of lining Patricia's pockets. I became friendly with several neighbors who had also been targeted by Patricia. Tom and Jennifer Richardson had been fined for having a vegetable garden that was supposedly too visible from the street. The Nguyen family had been cited for parking their boat in their driveway for more than 24 hours. Michael Sanders had been threatened with fines for flying an American flag that was allegedly too large. All of these violations were dropped under the new board, and the fines that had been paid were refunded. One evening in December, almost exactly 1 year after the snow stake controversy began, I was sitting in my living room when my doorbell rang. It was Marcus Chen, along with Tom Richardson and David Nguyen. "We wanted to thank you," Marcus said. "You stood up to Patricia when most of us were too afraid or too tired to fight. You exposed what she was doing and made it possible for the rest of us to take back our neighborhood." "I just didn't want to pay ridiculous fines," I said, though I appreciated the sentiment. "Well, whatever your motivation, you did a good thing. This is for you." Tom handed me a bottle of expensive whiskey, from all of us who suffered under Patricia's reign of terror. We spent the next hour sitting in my living room, drinking whiskey and sharing stories about the ridiculous things Patricia had done during her time as HOA president. It was therapeutic in a way, laughing about something that had caused so much stress and frustration. David Nguyen raised his glass. "To Patrick, who proved that sometimes the best way to deal with a bully is to let them destroy themselves." We all drank to that. As winter settled in again, I installed my snow stakes without any worry. The first significant snowfall came in mid-January, and Tom Sullivan was back as my snow removal service. He did his usual excellent job, following the markers perfectly and leaving my lawn pristine. I was watching from my kitchen window, coffee in hand, when I saw a white SUV drive past. For a split second, my stomach clenched, thinking it was Patricia's Mercedes. But it was just a neighbor, and they stayed well within the street boundaries. I realized that I had been holding on to more tension than I thought. The whole experience with Patricia had been exhausting, not just because of the legal battle, but because it had invaded my sense of safety and peace in my own home. For months, I had felt constantly vigilant, always watching for the next violation notice or the next attack. Even after she was gone, part of me had remained on edge, waiting for the other shoe to drop. But standing there that January morning, watching the snow fall and knowing that my property was protected, my rights were secure, and my neighborhood was in good hands, I finally felt that tension release. Patricia Morrison had tried to make my life miserable over something as simple as snow stakes, and in the end, her vindictiveness had been her own undoing. The buried property markers were still there, of course. They would remain there, anchored deep in the ground, for decades to come. They were a reminder that sometimes the best defense is simply standing your ground and letting the truth speak for itself. I finished my coffee and got ready for work, feeling grateful for the boring normalcy of a winter day in Minnesota. No HOA drama, no threatening letters, no lawsuits. Just snow, coffee, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that I had won not by being aggressive or vengeful, but by being patient, documenting everything and refusing to be bullied. The legal fees had been expensive, even with Patricia's payment, and the stress had taken its toll. But it had been worth it. I had learned valuable lessons about standing up for myself, about the importance of documentation, and about the power of community when people decide to work together instead of living in fear. I also learned that HOAs, while sometimes necessary for maintaining neighborhood standards, can become vehicles for abuse when the wrong people get into power. The covenants and rules that are supposed to protect property values and community harmony can be twisted into weapons of harassment and control. It takes vigilance and courage from homeowners to keep their HOA boards accountable, and I was glad that our neighborhood had found that courage. Over the following months, I watched as Pinewood Estates transformed. The new board under Marcus's leadership focused on real issues like maintaining common areas, organizing community events, and addressing legitimate safety concerns. They communicated transparently, held open meetings where homeowners could voice concerns, and made decisions based on common sense rather than petty power plays. The financial recovery was slower. Even with the restitution payments from Patricia and her husband, the HOA had to rebuild its reserves and restore trust. Some homeowners were reluctant to pay dues after learning how their money had been misused. Marcus and the new board addressed this by providing detailed quarterly financial reports, holding town halls to discuss budget priorities, and even setting up an oversight committee of homeowners who weren't on the board to review expenses. By spring, the neighborhood was thriving. Property values, which had actually started declining during Patricia's tenure, as people avoided buying into a community with such an aggressive HOA, began to recover. Homes that went on the market sold quickly, and new families moved in with enthusiasm rather than trepidation. I met one of the new families, the Petersons, when they moved in next door to where the Morrisons had lived. Sarah and Mike Peterson had 2 young kids and a golden retriever named Bailey. They were friendly and normal, excited about their new home and eager to be part of the community. "We heard there was some HOA drama before we moved in," Sarah said to me one day while we were both outside doing yard work. "But everyone says it's different now." "It is," I assured her. "We had a bad president who let power go to her head, but the neighborhood dealt with it." "The new board is great. That's good to hear. Our last neighborhood had no HOA at all, and it was chaos. People parking RVs in their front yards, houses painted crazy colors. We wanted some structure, but not, too much. I think we've found the right balance now." That conversation stuck with me because it highlighted what HOAs should be: a reasonable middle ground between total anarchy and authoritarian control. The goal should be maintaining basic standards that protect everyone's property values and quality of life, without micromanaging people's lives or creating arbitrary rules. Patricia had forgotten that, or maybe she never understood it in the first place. She had seen the HOA presidency as a position of power rather than service, and she had used it to satisfy her own need for control and her husband's need for extra income. In doing so, she had violated the trust of everyone who lived in Pinewood Estates. The criminal justice system had held her accountable, at least to some degree. The probation and restitution were appropriate, though some neighbors felt she should have faced harsher penalties. I was satisfied with the outcome. She had been exposed, removed from power, forced to pay back what she stole, and had to leave the neighborhood in shame. That seemed like justice enough. As for me, life went on. I continued working as a civil engineer, taking on projects across the Twin Cities. I dated occasionally, though nothing serious developed. I stayed active in the neighborhood, attending HOA meetings and volunteering for community events. I even joined the Architectural Review Committee, partly to make sure it never again became a tool for harassment. The snow stakes incident became something of a legend in Pinewood Estates. New residents would hear the story and react with amazement that anyone would try to ban such a practical item. Some of them would ask to see the buried survey markers that had destroyed Patricia's Mercedes, though there wasn't much to see except some slightly disturbed ground near the street edge. I kept the bent snow stake that Patricia had hit during her first encounter with my property markers. It sat in my garage as a memento, a reminder of how a small act of petty tyranny had snowballed into something much bigger. Sometimes I would look at it and shake my head, marveling at the absurdity of the whole situation. David Greenberg and I stayed in touch. He told me that HOA disputes were unfortunately common in his practice, though few escalated to the level mine had. He used my case as an example when advising other clients, emphasizing the importance of documentation and the value of standing firm on principle when you're clearly in the right. Most HOA disputes settle quietly because homeowners don't want the hassle of fighting, he told me over lunch one day. But sometimes you get a board member who's so unreasonable that fighting is the only option. You did everything right. You tried to resolve it reasonably first, you documented everything, and you didn't back down when she tried to bully you. I got lucky that she made so many mistakes, I said. Bullies usually do. They get overconfident and sloppy. Patricia thought she could do whatever she wanted because nobody had seriously challenged her before. She didn't count on running into someone who was willing and able to fight back. That conversation made me think about all the people who suffer under bad HOA boards, but don't have the resources or knowledge to fight back. How many homeowners pay unjust fines because they can't afford a lawyer? How many people tolerate harassment because they don't know their rights? The system is designed to favor HOAs because they hold so much power over people's homes, and that imbalance creates opportunities for abuse. I started researching HOA reform efforts in Minnesota and found that several state legislators had proposed bills to increase oversight of HOAs and protect homeowner rights. Some of the proposals included requiring HOAs to provide clearer notice of violations, establishing state-level mediation services for disputes, limiting the amounts and conditions for fines, and making it easier for homeowners to challenge HOA decisions. I contacted my state representative and shared my story. She was sympathetic and interested, and she invited me to testify at a legislative hearing about one of the reform bills. I agreed, thinking that if my experience could help change the law to protect other homeowners, then something good would come from the whole mess. The hearing was held at the state capitol in St. Paul in March. I sat in a committee room with about 30 other people, including homeowners with their own HOA horror stories and representatives from HOA management companies who opposed the reforms. When it was my turn to speak, I gave a 5-minute summary of what had happened with Patricia Morrison and the Pinewood Estates HOA. The current law gives HOA boards too much power with too little accountability, I concluded. Reasonable reforms that require transparency, establish clear procedures for violations and appeals, and provide accessible dispute resolution would protect homeowners without undermining legitimate HOA functions. Nobody should be fined hundreds of dollars per day for putting safety markers on their own property. The committee members asked me questions about the specifics of my case and how the reforms might have helped. I answered honestly, acknowledging that even with reforms, HOA disputes would still happen, but better procedures and oversight would prevent the worst abuses. The bill passed out of committee and eventually became law, though in a watered-down form that addressed some but not all of the issues. Still, it was progress. Minnesota HOAs would now be required to provide at least 15 days' notice before imposing fines, and they would have to allow homeowners to present their case to the full board, not just an individual board member. The law also capped daily fines at $100 and required HOAs to offer payment plans for large fine amounts. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. And I felt proud to have contributed to a change that would help other homeowners down the line. Back in Pinewood Estates, life continued its pleasant routine. The seasons changed, and another winter came and went without incident. My snow stakes went up and down without anyone complaining. The buried survey markers stayed undisturbed in the ground, protecting my property line. I eventually started dating someone seriously. Her name was Grace Walsh, and she was a teacher at a middle school in Minnetonka. We met at a coffee shop in Eden Prairie, struck up a conversation about a book we were both reading, and things developed from there. Grace was smart, funny, and refreshingly drama-free. When I told her about the HOA situation, she laughed and said it sounded like something out of a dark comedy. "You really just let her keep driving over your property markers?" she asked, her eyes wide. "I removed the visible stakes she had complained about," I said. "I didn't tell her to drive on my lawn. That was her choice. That's deliciously petty. I love it." Grace fit naturally into my life and into the neighborhood. She got along well with my neighbors, and she appreciated the community feeling that had been restored after Patricia's departure. We talked about moving in together eventually, maybe even getting married, though we were taking things slowly. One evening in late summer, Grace and I were sitting on my back deck, grilling burgers and enjoying the warm weather, when she asked me if I had any regrets about how I handled the situation with Patricia. I thought about it for a moment. "No," I said finally. "I tried to resolve it reasonably." She was the one who escalated at every turn. She could have just let me keep my snow stakes and focused on real problems. Instead, she made it personal, and it cost her everything. "Do you think she learned anything from it?" I doubt it. People like Patricia usually don't. They blame everyone else for their problems. She probably tells people that I set her up and ruined her life, rather than taking responsibility for her own actions. That's sad. It is, but I can't control what she thinks or does. I can only control my own choices and stand up for what's right. Grace smiled and reached across the table to take my hand. "That's one of the things I love about you. You have principles, and you don't back down when it matters." We sat there as the sun set, watching the fireflies begin to glow in the yard, and I felt a deep sense of contentment. The battle with Patricia Morrison had been difficult and stressful, but it had also taught me important lessons about courage, community, and standing up for myself. I had learned that documentation and patience could be more powerful than anger, and that justice, while sometimes slow, often prevails in the end. The following winter was my third since the snow stake controversy began, and it felt completely different from the previous two. I put my stakes up in October without a second thought. The first snow fell in November, and my driveway was cleared without incident. Life was exactly as boring and peaceful as it should be. I ran into Marcus Chen at the grocery store a few weeks before Christmas, and we chatted about neighborhood business. The HOA was in good financial shape, with reserves rebuilt and several improvement projects completed. Membership satisfaction was at an all-time high, according to the annual survey the new board had started conducting. "You know, Patrick, none of this would have happened without you pushing back against Patricia," Marcus said as we stood in the produce section. "You inspired the rest of us to demand better." "I was just protecting my property," I said modestly. "Maybe, but you did it the right way. You didn't get violent or crazy. You documented everything, followed the legal process, and exposed her corruption. That took guts." I had good help from David Greenberg. Still, a lot of people would have just given up and paid the fines, or they would have escalated in the wrong way and ended up in more trouble. You handled it perfectly. I appreciated the recognition, though I still felt like I had just been defending myself rather than being a hero. But I suppose that sometimes defending yourself effectively is heroic, especially when it helps others in the process. Christmas came and went, and I spent it with Grace and her family. We hosted New Year's Eve at my house, inviting several neighbors over for a party. It was exactly the kind of casual, friendly gathering that Patricia would have probably tried to fine me for, claiming noise violations or parking issues. But under the new board, nobody cared as long as we were reasonable about it. As midnight approached and we counted down to the new year, I found myself reflecting on how much had changed in 2 years. I had gone from a quiet homeowner who kept to himself to someone actively involved in his community. I had fought and won a significant legal battle. I had contributed to changing state law, and I had found a wonderful relationship with Grace, all because Patricia Morrison had decided that orange snow stakes were unacceptable. The absurdity of it still amazed me. If she had just left me alone, none of this would have happened. She would probably still be HOA president, still running her little schemes with her husband, still bullying neighbors. But her obsession with controlling every detail of the neighborhood had led her to pick a fight she couldn't win, and it had cost her everything. There was a lesson in that, I thought. Petty tyranny might seem easy and satisfying in the moment, but it builds resentment and resistance. Eventually, someone pushes back, and the whole house of cards collapses. Patricia had built her power on fear and intimidation, and when someone finally stood up to her, it all fell apart. As the countdown reached 0 and everyone cheered and hugged, Grace kissed me and whispered in my ear, "Happy New Year, Snow Stake Warrior." I laughed and kissed her back, feeling genuinely happy and hopeful about the future. The buried property markers were still there, silent sentinels protecting my boundaries. The snow stakes stood proudly on my lawn, serving their practical purpose without controversy. And life in Pinewood Estates was finally what it should have always been: peaceful, friendly, and normal. In the spring, Grace and I got engaged. We talked about looking for a bigger house together, maybe something with more land outside the city. But when I mentioned possibly leaving Pinewood Estates, I found myself hesitating. "I fought hard for this place," I told Grace. "I know that sounds silly, but I feel invested now. This is my community." "It doesn't sound silly at all," she said. "You helped make it a better place. That's worth staying for." So we decided to stay, at least for the foreseeable future. Grace moved into my house, and we started planning a wedding for the following fall. The neighborhood was thrilled, and several neighbors offered their yards for the ceremony if we wanted to have it locally. We ended up getting married at a venue in Chanhassen, but we held the reception at the Pinewood Estates clubhouse. It was a beautiful evening in September, with all our friends and family celebrating with us. Many of my neighbors attended, and during the toasts, Marcus Chen stood up and told the story of the snow stakes, much to everyone's amusement. "Patrick taught us all an important lesson," Marcus said, raising his glass. "Stand up for what's right, document everything, and let the karma bury itself." To Patrick and Grace, everyone cheered and drank, and I felt overwhelmed with gratitude for the community we had built. The fight with Patricia Morrison had been difficult, but it had brought people together and created lasting friendships. In a strange way, her tyranny had been the catalyst for something positive. Years passed, and life continued. Grace and I built our life together in Pinewood Estates. We talked about starting a family, and eventually, we welcomed a daughter named Lily. The neighborhood embraced her, and she grew up surrounded by friends and caring neighbors. Every winter, I still put out my snow stakes. They became something of a neighborhood tradition, with several other homeowners adopting the practice after seeing how well they worked. Nobody ever complained or tried to fine anyone for using them again. The buried survey markers remained in place, undisturbed, marking the boundaries of my property as they had for decades. Occasionally, when I was out working in the yard, I would look at the spot where Patricia's Mercedes had been damaged, and I would remember that chaotic period when my peaceful life had been upended by HOA drama. But mostly, I didn't think about it. The past was past, and the present was good. I had a wonderful wife, a beautiful daughter, and a home in a community that valued reasonableness over rigid control. The HOA continued to function well under responsible leadership, maintaining standards without oppression. I sometimes wondered what happened to Patricia Morrison. I heard through the grapevine that she and her husband divorced a few years after the criminal case concluded. Apparently, the stress of the legal troubles and the public shame had been too much for their relationship. She moved away from Minnesota entirely, supposedly to Arizona or Nevada, somewhere she could start over without the baggage of her reputation. I didn't take any pleasure in her misfortune. I had never wanted to destroy her life. I had just wanted to be left alone to protect my property in a sensible way. But she had made choices, and choices have consequences. If she had treated people with respect and fulfilled her duties honestly, none of it would have happened. As Lily grew older, she would sometimes ask about the stakes we put out every winter. I explained their purpose, and when she was about 8 years old, she asked why we needed them if everyone knew where the property line was. Because sometimes people make mistakes, especially when snow covers everything, I told her. The stakes help prevent accidents and damage. They're a simple solution to a common problem. Did someone not like them once? She asked. Kids always picked up on things. Someone thought they were ugly and tried to make me take them down. But it turns out they're important, and now everyone understands that. That's silly, Lily declared. They're just sticks. Who cares? Exactly, I said, ruffling her hair. Who cares? It was that simple, really. The whole conflict, the lawsuits, the stress, the drama, all of it came down to someone caring way too much about something that didn't matter and trying to impose her will on others. If Patricia had just shrugged and moved on, none of it would have happened. But she hadn't. And so the story of the snow stakes became part of Pinewood Estates lore, a cautionary tale about the dangers of petty tyranny and the importance of standing up for common sense. I served a term on the HOA board myself eventually, making sure to stay true to the principles of reasonable governance and respect for homeowners. It was boring work, mostly dealing with mundane maintenance issues and organizing community events, which was exactly how it should be. The HOA was a tool for managing shared resources and maintaining basic standards, not a vehicle for personal power or profit. Grace often joked that I had become the neighborhood's unofficial expert on HOA issues. People would call me when they had questions about covenants or needed advice on dealing with the board. I was happy to help, sharing the lessons I had learned from my experience. You're like the HOA whisperer, Grace teased. I just know what it's like to be on the wrong end of an abuse of power, I said. I don't want anyone else to go through what I went through. The neighborhood thrived under good governance. Property values increased steadily, and Pinewood Estates developed a reputation as a well-managed, friendly community. When people asked me why I liked living there, I would tell them about the neighbors, the parks, the walking trails, and the responsible HOA that focused on real issues instead of manufactured controversies. And every winter, when the first snow fell and I went out to install my snow stakes, I would think back to that morning when I watched Patricia's Mercedes hit my buried survey marker. I remembered the satisfaction of knowing that her own bad choices had led to that moment, and that justice, while sometimes slow and expensive, had ultimately prevailed. The stakes stood as more than just practical markers. They were symbols of the right to reasonable use of your own property, the importance of standing up to bullies, and the power of documentation and patience over anger and rash action. They reminded me that sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It is simply standing your ground and letting nature take its course. As I write this, more than a decade has passed since the snow stake controversy. Patricia Morrison is a distant memory for most people in Pinewood Estates. The neighborhood has moved on, growing and evolving with new families and new challenges. But the lessons from that time remain relevant. HOAs serve an important function when run properly, but they require vigilance from homeowners to prevent abuse. Power, even small-scale power like running a neighborhood association, can corrupt people who aren't suited for leadership. And when that happens, it takes courage from ordinary residents to stand up and demand accountability. I was fortunate to have the resources and knowledge to fight back effectively. Not everyone does, which is why HOA reform and homeowner education are so important. People need to know their rights, understand the covenant documents they're agreeing to when they buy a home, and be willing to get involved in HOA governance to keep it honest. My advice to anyone facing an unreasonable HOA is simple. Document everything, know your rights, seek legal counsel early, and don't be afraid to stand your ground if you're in the right. The process may be stressful and expensive, but giving in to bullies only encourages more bullying. Sometimes you have to fight, not just for yourself, but for everyone who comes after you. And if you live in a place with harsh winters, put out your snow stakes. They work, they're legal, and they're worth defending. Trust me on that. Life in Pinewood Estates continues peacefully. My family is happy, my neighbors are friendly, and the HOA functions as it should. The buried survey markers still rest beneath the ground, silent reminders of a time when they played an unexpected role in bringing down a petty tyrant. Every winter, I smile when I install those orange stakes, remembering the absurdity of someone trying to ban them, and grateful for the community we built in the aftermath. Patricia Morrison tried to make my life difficult over something trivial, and instead, she made my community stronger and taught us all the value of reasonable governance. That's not the ending she wanted, but it's the one she earned. And as I stand in my yard, surrounded by neighbors who respect each other and a HOA that serves rather than oppresses, I can't help but feel that everything worked out exactly as it should have. The snow falls, the stakes stand tall, and life goes on in Pinewood Estates, peaceful and drama-free, just as a neighborhood should be.